r/AskReddit. What's a family secret you didn't get told until you were older that made things finally make sense? That my sister, she was 16 when I was born. And kicked out, is my mother. Her mother, my grandma, raised me as her daughter. It doesn't end there. I was a product of abuse from a family friend. To this day I don't know who my real dad is. My grandma was in her 40s when she had me. And my sister was sent to a boarding school when she was pregnant with me. My sister has no idea that I know. One of my most beloved mom's recipes was actually hamburger helper. She was a from scratch cook and literally everything else we ate she made herself. She never told us because it made her so mad that her kids would love a boxed meal so much. She did it once out of sheer desperation because she didn't have time to cook one night. We ended up loving it. I only found out in college because I begged for the recipe. I love giving her crap for it to this day. My dad never called his stepmom anything but her real name, Margaret. He has 7 brothers and sisters and they all called her mom or some form of that. When I got older it turns out my grandpa was actually cheating on my real grandma, my dad's mom, with Margaret while she was dying for colon cancer. My dad was 5 when she dies and as she was dying my dad had to call my grandpa to tell him to come home because she was dying. After that Margaret and her 3 kids moved in and my dad was forced to live with his sister who was 18 and married. This was late 70s backcountry, so not abnormal for the time. From then until he turned 16 when he decided to move in with his best friend and his mom. So I learned that he probably has always had resentment towards Margaret because of everything that happened when he was so young and never wanted to call her anything that resembled a mother because that's not what she was to him. That my aunt's close friend that she lives with is actually her girlfriend. Was about 22 when they told me. Never even thought about it until it was said. Weird how I was completely oblivious to this for so many years. Not all that extreme. But it was emotional for me. My grandfather was the typical tough, rugged mountain man. He never expressed emotion and in fact rarely ever even spoke at family gatherings. He would just sit in the corner drinking beer. I never felt that he and I had a very good relationship. Considering I was the weird, artsy kid in the family. We didn't have much to talk about because we couldn't relate to each other well. He died of lung cancer 2 years ago. A couple of months after he died I was visiting my parents and my mom pulled out a shoebox that belonged to him filled with sentimental photographs that he kept hidden in his closet. Nobody knew about it until after he died and they were cleaning his things out. Almost every single photograph was of me. It broke my heart. I wish I would have been closer to him. He clearly loved me a lot more than I thought he did. My grandma and grandpa have been separated since we were all young kids. My grandpa would always fall asleep on the couch before we went to bed on holidays and when we'd wake up in the morning, he was out getting coffee. We never thought anything of it because they were still always together. However, looking back, I don't remember them ever being in the same room or ever really interacting beyond the age of about 5. They're very Catholic and don't believe in divorce. Yet they both have new significant others who are pushing them for marriage. Holidays are very weird now. My pet rabbit got attacked by something a couple years after I got it. My parents found it dead and replaced it before I found out. I just thought my rabbit lived super long but it was actually 2 rabbits. This happened over 10 years ago and I found out last year. My parents were swingers. That my grandparents didn't talk to each other 20 years before my grandfather finally kicked the bucket. They lived in the same house the entire time too and no one knows why they weren't on speaking terms. My mom was in the hospital so I flew home. Me and my dad were hanging out getting drunk and he started telling me family secrets. Almost like he was trying to get a reaction out of me. An uncle was molested. An estranged aunt might actually have a different father than we thought. Etc. The one that really got me was when he revealed that he used to do coke. I was imagining he meant like in his 20s. I said, when did you stop? And he said, I think you were about 19. Like fucking what, man? My entire childhood? And he said, yup. Did mom know? Yes. How much? About a gram a week. At first it was completely insane to me. But looking back it made a ton of stuff make way more sense. Crazy mood swings. Explosive fights. One minute he would be fine and then suddenly he would be raving about something. I knew he drank, so I always blamed the instability in the house on that. But finding out he was regularly doing coke all my life was both astounding and it made complete sense. I didn't know one of my cousins existed until I was about 10 years old. Turns out he was diagnosed with leukemia as a child and I was a very sensitive kid. So my family decided not tell me until the treatment was successful and he recovered. It would have been okay if they told me as soon as he was healthy again. But I guess they forgot, so the first time I met him, I was wondering how exactly I managed to forget the existence of a whole person. My uncle came to visit us when I was little, and before he came mum sat me down and told me not to be alone with my uncle. And that if he made me feel uncomfortable to let her know. Found out last year that when my mum was 9, she was raped by my uncle. Edit. Accidentally wrote her uncle instead of my uncle in the last sentence. That my dad was a pedophile. Had no clue. Even through a decade of abuse, I was told to keep a secret by him. And my family kept the secret from me because they had thoughts of him being better or reformed. So, when I was 15 I realized it was wrong. Or, it all started to make sense. Who knew? As a child, you can't trust your own father? My aunt and uncle, who passed away when I was 11, were drug addicts. I adored them, but as I got older I started seeing less and less of them and never understood why. My parents briefly told me when I was 16 and that my uncle didn't die of a brain tumor, actually had one though, but instead he shot himself while my aunt was in the other room, which led to my aunt's drug-related death on New Year's Day. They finally told me the whole story when I was 21. I was the last person to know. Even my little brother knew before me, because I was extremely close to them and looked so highly of them. I still do. I wish I would have known sooner, but I understand why they didn't tell me. My grandparents forced my aunt to get an abortion before my family moved to America, rendering her permanently sterile. It finally makes sense why none of the adults talk about having children around her. My father always talked about how his brother lied to a doctor so he could get on disability. I thought it was so easy for anyone to get a disability check. All you had to do was tell your doctor you were abducted by aliens. Years later, my father had a mental breakdown. He started telling stories about the government implanting a chip in his brain. He went out and got a CAT scan as proof. And he would point to things that weren't there. My dad was diagnosed as a schizophrenic. And years later, he started collecting a disability check because he couldn't hold a job. Kind of hard to perform any job when every conversation, including interviews, veers into the government trying to fuck me in the ass. As an adult, it dawned on me when my aunt mentioned mental illness runs in the family. My uncle had never lied to his doctor. He told that doctor what he believed to be the absolute truth. He had been abducted by aliens. I have an uncle who is a hardcore alcoholic and lived with my grandparents until they passed. We always thought he was just a non-motivated loser. I have another uncle that passed away well before I was born, got hit by a car coming back from the store getting something for my grandparents. After both grandparents passed, my mom told me that the alcoholic uncle was asked to go to the store but bribed his little brother to go instead, which led to his death. My grandmother, who I have always held in very high regard, told my alcoholic uncle afterward that his brother would still be alive if he had gone to the store like she asked. I cannot imagine the guilt that would have laid on him and completely understand why he ended up that way as a result. In my adult life I've found that my uncle is actually a pretty good man. Just dealt a shitty hand. That my granny attempted suicide when my mom was in high school. My mom was the one that found her. Luckily she did find her, because if she hadn't she wouldn't have survived. It explains why my mom panics the way she does and jumps to conclusions all the time. If she can't get a hold of me or my brother on the phone, she automatically assumes we are dead and she panics. Recently, she couldn't get a hold of my brother for a few hours and she lost all composure and had a nervous breakdown. We just are starting to realize after all these years that she probably has undiagnosed PTSD. My dad met my mom in a strip club. When I was really young I never got why my dad wouldn't allow drinks like Kool-Aid in the house. Especially if it was grape. Later in life I found out he was part of the cleanup crew for Johnstown. Edit. I didn't think it would get this much attention. I just thought it was weird that dad was so against all the drinks you mixed up from a powder. Not even the country time stuff. I could have them at a friend's place though. My brothers and I all share very distinctive teeth with my dad. But no one else in the family has it. After my gran died I found some letters between her and my granddad while he was on national service. Going by the dates. Granddad was in Malaya when my dad was conceived. Edit. The four of us all have severely crossed front teeth. Right over left. And the bottom front row are crowded. All in the same way. I have no idea if dad knows. We don't really talk. Gran is visibly pregnant in the wedding photos. Just about. And my granddad wasn't the brightest spark to it, maybe he didn't realize. He absolutely doted on my dad. And they didn't have any more children. That place you visited dad and got to eat potato chips and one of them was like an extra big potato chip? Yeah. That was jail. And it was because he was caught drunk driving while also having a bunch of cocaine. So I guess the don't do more than one illegal thing at a time advice he later gave me made sense. Also why we moved and then he wasn't around for a while. Edit. For those of you wondering about the extra big potato chip. It was like 3 times the size of a normal chip. I saved it for last. Coupled with the fact that I didn't normally get to eat chips. I'm pretty sure that chip is the only reason I remember that day. Something felt strange about my grandfather's funeral. Just the way they were emphasizing his place in heaven. Later found out that he shot himself in the heart with a 357. Same side of the family also had seemingly random people show up at family gatherings throughout my life that ended up being illegitimate children of my grandma. I just started gaining uncles and cousins. Confused the shit out of me as a child. My brother and I are only half siblings. We didn't know that my dad isn't his dad until I was 10 and he was 15. The only reason he was told was because my mom was trying to manipulate him into choosing her side in the divorce. Uncle killed a guy during a fight. But that uncle died when I was 9. I was told about it later. It explained a lot. It was a small town and people were scared of him. Growing up, I was told that my grandfather had 5 siblings. But I had only ever met one of them. As I got older, I was told that one brother had died from AIDS. Another brother had gone crazy from Agent Orange exposure. Yet another brother was living 2 blocks away but had been shunned because he was gay. And sister was developmentally delayed and had basically become a ward of the state after their mother died. It made me understand why my grandfather was so into those cheesy Hallmark movie moments. He wanted to make some happy family memories. Fortunately, my grandfather and his shunned brother were able to reconcile before the brother's death. That my mom was born from an affair. My grandma first got pregnant at 16 and then again at 17. With my 2 aunts. She actually got married like a week after turning 16. Well, when she was 21, she had an affair with a really rich dude. And thus, my mom was conceived. It was always weird to me that my aunts were tall, blonde, and quite sensible. Meanwhile, my mom is short, brunette, and batshit crazy. My grandma ended up getting a divorce like a year later because of this. Also, the rich guy was also married and had a child with his equally batshit wife. So, I have an aunt Stevie no one told me about. Kind of related. But after my grandma got the divorce and my mom was like 7, the rich guy's wife burst through the front window demanding that she buy my mom off my grandma. Like, she went through a sheet of glass. Explains why I am so different from my aunts and supposed grandpa. My youngest uncle is actually my oldest cousin. My dad used to grow weed at the plant nursery he used to run when I was a kid. That explains why there was an opaque tarp covering the back half of Greenhouse 5. And why my parents told my brother and I never to go back there. And why some real scruffy looking young guys were always coming around blasting music all the time even though the only people I ever saw buying the regular plants were older men covered in dirt and driving trucks. Apparently my brother got into it and sold it to some of his friends at school in exchange for candy. He was in the 5th grade at the time. Only like 10, my parents naturally freaked out and scrapped the whole crop. The back half of greenhouse 5 went back to growing regular plants and dad sold the expensive UV lights he was using to grow them. Uncle Bob was actually an FBI wanted person of interest for working on biological weapons and ties to white supremacy groups. My mom, aunts, and uncle always called my pap by his first name, not dad or anything. When I was a kid, I thought maybe he just wanted them to call him by his name. Then one day, my mum mentioned something about her dad. I think she means my pap. Nope. My mum was the product of an affair and both men, my gram's first husband and my mum's biological dad, thought of her as their own and basically co-parented. This was in the early 1960s. Both men raised my mum as their daughter until my gram's first husband passed away. And before anyone says anything about my gram, she was married off when she was 16 to an older man to save face for the family. It was not a marriage of love but convenience. She fell in love with my grandpa and had permission from her first husband to peruse the relationship. Saw this above as well. I was 13 years old when I learned that my father was not my biological father. I confronted my mother and she denied it until I gave his name. It was my grandmother who told me drunkenly. Everyone in my family knew. Extended and all. I ended up finding him on my own though Facebook and other avenues. I ended up meeting him at 14. And gained a whole family after that. Aunts, uncles, a brother and sister, grandmother, everything. I was able to spend 4 years with him before he passed away from cancer. I visit that side of my family every chance I get. They are some of the most genuine and loving people I have in life. But I wouldn't have changed it. I had an adoptive father, didn't know he wasn't biological until the secret was let out, that raised me since birth. I'm his only child. And I could not ask for a better dad. Even after him and my mom split, he was the best father I could have ever asked for. I really wouldn't change it for the world. My father was a capo from the Neapolitan Camorra, was wanted by the Interpol, and couldn't set a foot back in Italy without being immediately apprehended. He was also living under a stolen identity he used when he fled a high security prison in Italy. My last name never was my family name. That and much more. I used to like telling this story when I found out. Since everyone thought I was lying or joking anyway. I was 12. And only found out because my mom broke down after father was detained in Spain while we lived in Argentina. Which meant he might never come back to us. He escaped prison again a year later. Grandpa is a pedo with a track record in my family. That's why I never got left alone with him. Unfortunately my cousins did. The expected happened. And then the unexpected. After 40 some years he finally got reported and is now rotting in a county jail. When I was 7 years old, I remember my mom was really excited and telling me I was gonna have a little sibling. Then one day she suddenly stopped talking about it. I kinda just assumed she made a mistake and really wasn't pregnant. Fast forward to last month and she told me that pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. Probably shouldn't have expected that, but it was still kind of shocking for here. That my grandfather raped my grandmother and that's how she conceived my dad. He used to beat my dad unconscious when my dad was as young as 5 years old and my grandmother did nothing about it. My grandmother then finally left my grandfather only to be with an alcoholic pedophile who sexually abused young boys in church. She has great taste in men. Explains why my grandmother and father had a strained relationship and why one Christmas my step-grandfather was covered in bruises. He said he had a fall, but when everything came out about his past, it was actually because a young boy who he'd abused tracked him down years later and beat the living shit out of him. My cousin that is a year younger than what we thought was the youngest sibling is our brother. His mom is my dad's niece. It's what finally made my mom file for divorce. The drugs, alcohol, beatings, cheating. She could overlook, but having an affair with his niece and then having a baby was the last straw. We grew up thinking he was our cousin. I guess that's true. He called my dad dad and we never questioned it cause we thought he was just copying his older cousins. Only my mom and siblings know about it when it all came out when my dad died. I found out when I was 15 but never said anything to anyone. Dad sits us down sometime before Christmas and says I am a woman. Ha. And I thought he was gay. To clarify, this wasn't quite a family secret. But my mom knew several months before and was really stressing about what would happen when my siblings and I were told. A more accurate response to the question would be regarding my aunt, who had been transgender all my life without me knowing. It's funny. In retrospect these things seem obvious. But you only see what you want to see. I love my aunt. She's one of the most interesting, crazy people on the planet. I harbor no sore feelings for my dad regarding her gender transition. But she, sorry this is still fresh for me, is a pretty shitty person for other reasons. Not explicitly at our family, but a family that were our friends all of a sudden shut us out. And I didn't really know why. Turns out, the mom that adopted all the kids was having sex with the oldest, 16 at the time, 18 before he went to college, and called my mom whining about how the kid confessing screwed her over. Great stuff. My parents would never talk about my grandpa, my mom's dad, and I would always ask what happened to him since he died and more info about him. My parents would always just say he died of a heart attack and was accountant and always get the look in their face. Little did I know he was an alcoholic who killed himself. It was just hard for my mom to talk about him. I posted this before. But my parents met at the beginning of an 8-day long coke bender for some mutual friends they had. 8 days of partying later, my father flew back out west. He was on the East Coast visiting family. My mom visited him 3 months later. He proposed when she got off the plane. I am the firstborn. I showed up 3 years later. I was told they met in college. Well, some of the people at the party were in college. So I guess that counts. My mother was molested by her 4 brothers, used as a target for a BB gun, and so on. She had a horrid childhood, which in turn is why mine was so fucking awful. So, it really does make a lot more sense now. I thought she was just evil. Turns out she is just really fucked up emotionally and mentally. Found out when I was 11 that the older girl who lived down the street from me who was like a sister to me was actually my older sister. We have a great relationship as adults. We talk a dozen times a year or so and visit each other sometimes. But it is a very meaningful relationship and we really did a lot of growing up together. I'm glad our parents let us play together so much when we were children. Through my childhood I always remembered my dad throwing my favorite older sister out of a moving car. My dad was arrested and was gone for some time. My sister never lived with us after that. I only saw her once more. I remember having nightmares about this and that it all went down on my 6th birthday. When I was 22 my mom and aunt told me that my dad had raped my sister. He was taken away and put into rehab. She was taken away and put into foster care. They swept it all under the rug and went on with life. I'm 46 and I'm still not over it. Protect all children. My grandpa burned to death. I found out he died when I was a kid, but was not allowed to go to his funeral. And they told me he had a heart attack. I was so confused because everyone around me would clam up when I asked about him. Turns out that he had a heart attack while trying to put out a field fire. Collapsed and burned. I still have no idea how long it took for people to find him, but I'm assuming it was hours. My mom planned me. I always believed. Wasn't until I was 24 I learned my father didn't. And that's why my father fucking hates me. I'm a little late to the party. And it's kinda a 2-stage situation here. When I was 5 my parents informed me I was adopted. Cool. I was a tough young but I coped and got over that. I'd rather have heard it than when I was like 20. But at the time they never told me why. Turns out there were several things at play here. Mother is a carrier of muscular dystrophy. Her brother had the active version and didn't live a fun or long life. And she didn't want to pass that on. Mother also had a hysterectomy as a very young age. Somewhere in her late teens early 20s. Does not like to talk about it so I'm not quite sure when it was. Parents are first cousins. Didn't find that one out right away either but it does make a whole bunch of sense. My parents are the black sheep of the family. Turns out that's the primary reason why. No one in the family approved. Had a creepy uncle that everybody felt uncomfortable near. He was more annoying than creepy. Anyway, never liked the guy. One day when I was about 17 he asked for a handshake. Locked his hand over mine and said, "Aren't you going to kiss your uncle's hand?" And tried to pull his hand near to my head. I freaked out and said that I was going to beat the shit out of him if he didn't let me go that instant. It sounded way cooler in Portuguese, and when he refused to let me go I overpowered him and managed to land a couple kicks until my father arrived. I stopped thinking that maybe I went too far, but dad started to beat the crap out of him when I told that he asked for a kiss. Later I was informed that my uncle was indeed a sex harasser. I grew up never knowing my paternal grandpa. The last time I saw him in person was when I was 5 and he was in prison. Turns out my aunt made some particularly shitty teenage decisions that ended in my grandpa getting framed for drug trafficking. He got hit with a 20-year sentence. No amount of appeals would get his case reopened. And he was deported as soon as he was let out. My grandpa's one of the strongest, kindest people I've known. But since he's in his 80s now and I don't have the money to see him, he'll probably pass away before I get the chance to see him in person again. My father had another child years before he was with my mother. My dad's mother tried to kill my mom with a knife right after my parents got married because she didn't want anyone taking her baby away. She was yelling that if she can't have her son then no one can. Then when she couldn't stab my mother, she tried to kill my father instead. My uncle cheated on my aunt when he'd go away on weekends for events related to a hobby a little over a decade into their marriage. And apparently everyone at those weekends knew. My aunt would be home with 3 young kids while he was openly running around with another woman. Finally understood why my dad was always a little weird about him. Why one of his kids has had a hot and cold relationship with him. And also why he and my aunt are so into this marriage group thing they do. To the point of always going to conferences even when money is super tight. Found out I'm likely autistic, but my parents didn't take me for any further doctor's visits to confirm once it was posited as a potential diagnosis. Parents didn't want me on any psychological meds, so they just stopped. Still undiagnosed. But it would explain a lot of the emotional issues I had as a kid as well as the unconventional social skills I have now. But maybe I'm not autistic. Dunno. I like my life as it is. Edit. It's fascinating that so many people are in the same boat. I am curious to get diagnosed. But I'm also pushing 35 and I've got my shit together. It would be validating to know for sure. But it's not high priority. I'll check out some resources and see what I have access to. Thanks everyone. Both my brothers and I are really half brothers and we were all conceived through artificial insemination from different donors. Thanks 23andMe. I was an only child and my mother was 40 and father 50 when they had me. They had gotten together rather late in life. My mother always told me that my father didn't want her to get pregnant because he was afraid she was too old and didn't want anything happening to her or the baby. After my father passed away at the age of 95, I took my mother to the Social Security office to take care of paperwork. One of the questions they asked was whether there were any other potential beneficiaries of my father's benefits such as other children or ex-wives. Being an only child, I immediately answered no. My mother looked at me sheepishly and answered, "That's not exactly correct." It was then, at the age of 45 in the Social Security building, that I learned that my father had previously been married in his 20s and had had a child. Mother and baby died during childbirth. It explained why my parents never had children until late in life and why he had not wanted to. My sister and I both got UTIs at the same time when our family was staying at our grandparents' house. One day my grandma took both of us aside and started what felt like an interrogation about whether any adults had touched us. Like, if something happened, you have to tell me right now. At the time, I felt gross, confused, and guilty. Even though nothing had happened. It was just too intense. I later learned that my grandma had been sexually abused by her brother for years and her mother refused to believe her. My grandfather was one of 6 children from a Jewish family that escaped Europe at the start of the Holocaust. All 5 of his siblings committed suicide. My husband, 50, and his 3 siblings, 48, 54, 55, just found out a few months ago that their mother, 80, was adopted. I have done my own research as I'm too afraid to ask my aunt or grandma. But as far as I can tell, grandpa wasn't forced into early retirement because he stole someone's teapot. He was stocking up on guns. About a year ago, my mother revealed to me that my younger cousin is also my brother. My late father donated sperm to my mother's sister as she'd had several miscarriages in the past. So technically my younger cousin is also my younger brother. I couldn't care less and I love him more than anything. My mother has had a rough past. She was kicked out of her house at 16 and got pregnant at 18 and decided to keep the baby, my half-brother, after having several abortions before. His father hung himself, my mom found him, and so my mom had to take care of my brother alone. For 3 months. My brother was forced to live with his grandparents, his dad's parents, while my mom tried to pull her life together. When she finally did, she met my dad and later had my sisters and I. My grandma, mom's mom, moved in with us. She was only supposed to stay with us for 3 months but ended up staying for 10 years, and I always wondered why she lived with us. Turns out my mother didn't want to throw her out on the streets like my grandma did to her, and so she let her stay with us. I later found out my brother moved out when she moved in with us because he resents her for not supporting him and my mom. Addition story. I just recently found out my dad watched his stepdad and uncle die in a motorcycle accident, which is why my parents never let us ride on own motorcycles. My dad once tried to murder someone. Attacked him with a knife in a fit of rage. I found out when he told the story. Rather nonchalantly. In a Bible study I attended with him as an adult. At the time I was struggling to come to terms with the violence in my home and worrying that I was somehow to blame. Or that if people knew things that happened to me, they'd think I somehow deserved it. Knowing that my dad straight up tried to murder a guy helped me come to terms with the idea that really, he can be a cruel person and that victims shouldn't feel blame for that. Had to make a throwaway for this, since some family might recognize my name. About 6 years ago I found out that my older brother and his mom, different moms but I live with them, and our grandparents, have been having sex for years. They shared a bedroom for a while when I was a kid. But it never occurred to me that there was a reason for it. Even more alarming is that my grandmother told me a little before this that the same brother had admitted to being in love with me. Which explains why they never left us alone together, I guess. My dad had a first marriage my sisters and I knew nothing about till we were in our mid-30s. He married my mom when he was 34 and she was 21. I always thought he was just a super late bloomer. But he forbade my mom from telling us he spent his 20s married to a different woman. Only after his Alzheimer's was real bad did she reveal his big secret. That my dad wasn't my dad. Finally explained how come I got beat and had to go to bed when my younger sister was up and happy, while I laid in bed and cried. My grandmother has always been mean to her oldest daughter, my mom's sister. She was always belittling her and criticizing her. I remember even when I was a kid, I thought she was just being so mean to her for no reason whatsoever. I just assumed she played favorites with her children to an extreme degree. When I was about 20, I learned that my grandmother conceived my aunt out of wedlock before she had met and married my grandfather, and was mean to her because she doesn't like being reminded about that part of her past. I had previously lost respect for her when I thought she was being mean to my aunt for no reason. When I found out the real reason, I just lost even more respect for her. When I was around 6-8 years old, my uncle passed away. I thought it was something sudden and medically tragic, as I remember him having lung problems of some sort. When I got older I found out he committed suicide because his girlfriend broke up with him. I remember visiting my dad and hanging out in my uncle's room where we got to play video games and listen to cool music with him. That was the start of me learning about mental illness running in the family and connected a lot of dots for me. My grandma used to give my dad Valium something like it when he was a small child and tell him it was his vitamins. That part of my family is seriously messed up, and now I understand some of my grandma's behavior was not early dementia Alzheimer's but in fact just who she was. As a kid I always wondered why my dad and his sister were raised by their grandparents. I was later told by my mother that his biological mom was killed by his biological dad and then he committed suicide. His grandparents adopted them and his dad's side of the family was basically forgotten about. I know absolutely nothing about that side of my dad's family. My grandma married her first cousin. It was a second marriage for both and in their late 50s. Not sure how it even was legal. Was described as more of a friendship to me after I put the pieces together. It was very confusing as a kid why your grandparents talked about having the same grandmother though. My grandmother died when I was 16. While we were cleaning out our house I found a large stash of family photos including my dad's wedding picture. To not my mom. Turns out my dad was married before he married my mom. Explains why my dad was always deemed old by my friends' standards. I asked my mom if she knew and she said of course in the least convincing tone. My dad is, and always has been, a gay man. He and my mom have been married for 35 years. And she knew he was gay when they got married. Their plan was for him to live a normal life as a straight, religious, family man. That worked pretty well for the first decade. Then, he cheated on my mom. Over the next 15 years, he cheated on her with men on 4 separate occasions. Including a full-blown 7-month on-again off-again affair. She's forgiven him every time. But it's getting to the point where it's just sad for both of them. Mom. It's time to leave dad. You love him. He loves you. But it's not worth the pain and paranoia you've been dealing with for decades. Dad. You're gay. You want to be with a man. So. Go be gay. That's completely fine. But stop hurting mom. They're still together. My uncle's gay. Explains why his friend stayed at my parents' house with him when he visited. How my mom's side of the family escaped communist China in the 1970s. Lived in the Kowloon-walled city for about 4 years and became refugees in the US. Explains why my mom is so frugal and doesn't trust the government. Dad was adopted. Half my family history is a lie. I was never close to those assholes anyways. I wish he had told me sooner. As I'm sure you're aware. I was adopted. No. I was not aware. Oh. Nobody told you? You didn't tell me. I love that guy. We're kindred spirits. I wish he had told me sooner. My brother knew for years. Mom too and they never told me. Out of 4 girls. I'm the only one who can biologically have kids. I didn't find out until I was 24. And then only because my mom wanted me to shut the fuck up asking my recently married sister when they were going to have kids. I now understand why my parents were so grossly underprepared to explain menstruation to me. The third daughter. They'd never had to do it before. Edit. I'm not going to go into detail. But the reason is chromosomal. They basically don't have the necessary internal parts and had to take hormone therapy. Edit 2. Don't ask people when if they're going to have kids. I had to learn this lesson the hard way. But you don't have to. It's none of your goddamn business. I kind of figured it out thanks to science class. But I was told that someone else was my father for my whole life, who I now refer to as my stepdad. Apparently the adults in my life felt that I was fairly mature and were going to tell me when I was about 10. But my stepfather died. So that made it weird. Hey kid, don't worry, he's not really your dad, so the secret was kept until my teen years. Was told my aunt and uncle died because of a carbon monoxide leak in their house. When I was 16 I was told the truth. My uncle was having serious money problems. He shot my aunt and then hung himself. That my grandfather is bald. Go to say he was hella good at hiding it. That my grandmother's husband was a pedophile. All of a sudden I knew why my uncle was so weird and would pick me up and carry me away rather than let me stay alone in a room with him. For the longest time I thought my uncle was a real prude. My male cousins could all swim naked or run around in just their swim trunks. But my uncle made me always wear a swimsuit and put on a cover up when I came out of the pool. He later admitted if God forbid he touched you, I was making sure no one could try to blame you. They blamed all his other victims for being too tempting. My uncle, bless his heart, wanted to kill that man so bad. For that matter, so did my dad. Finding out the pedo was, well, a pedo, made all of their muttering to each other at family gatherings make so much more sense. If you want to get nothing in return, you can like and join my Discord. There is a link in the description.